All right, we are live. Welcome, Melyn. Thank you for joining Parasocial. Parasocial is the people behind the protocols where we bring on awesome founders like yourself and learn more about what you're building. So, to kick off, maybe you want to give a quick intro about who you are, what you do, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I love the name of this series, Parasocial. It's such a fun play on words. Well done on whoever named that. But we are very excited, enthusiastic members of the para community. So also really glad to be here. I'm Melyn McKay. I'm the founder of Coala Pay. And my background is pretty unusual for Web3. I have spent the last 15 years in the humanitarian aid sector and did my training, my graduate degrees in anthropology. So not kind of what you would anticipate as a sort of like Web3 profile, but really came to Web3 when I was working in Myanmar. And overnight, it became very, very difficult to send payments to partners and vendors and others. And started trying to figure out how we could use blockchain to make that process a bit faster. I think unlike most products that start from what is the core offering, what is the thing that we can bring to you, we sort of flipped that on its head because stablecoins in the aid sector are so obvious when you're sending aid payments to 130 countries, many of which are constrained corridors. It's like, of course, yeah, stablecoins are a really clear, obvious solution. So when we started working on our product design, we started from, well, what are the reasons that someone would have to say no? And then we built something to overcome those no's, and that became our tech stack. So we have a verticalized solution for the aid sector that allows aid sector users to actually send payments on blockchain and have all the data and reconciliation information they need to feed that back to their existing ERP management systems. So they've got a really simplified, streamlined end-to-end experience.
Amazing. So there's a lot there. And obviously your background is insane because not only do you know the anthropology side of things and how these aid organizations work, but you also know the crypto side of things. So I want to spend a little bit of time on everything you just said about that entire value chain, because I don't think a lot of our listeners are familiar with that value chain. And so you mentioned ERPs, you mentioned NGOs, and you mentioned this like aid money. What are the different sorts of parties that interact in this value chain? And where does Koala Pay, I know Koala Pay kind of sits like through all along that process, but like where do you guys fit into that value chain?
Yeah. So the way that, well, let's start with the client piece. So we say clients, not users, but for anybody listening, we mean a user. And those are institutional users. So really important differentiator. We're not fundraising from individuals and then taking those funds pulled from lots of individual donations and sending them somewhere. That there are lots of people who do that much better than we do, so we don't even bother. What we do is we work with large institutional aid actors. So the kinds of actors who are managing $50 to $100 million funds, which are set aside from, generally speaking, public sector funding channels. So that could be from Norwegian taxpayers or from EU mechanisms. So this is public sector money, which means that it's subject to incredible scrutiny and it's very particular about what you can do with it. Normally, if you fundraise from individuals, it's sort of not earmarked to a specific type of intervention. It doesn't have to go to health. It doesn't have to go to education. It can't be used on staff salaries. You can use it however you want. Public sector funding is very, very specific. It has to be used on whatever it's been allocated for. And the budgets that are set up 2 years prior, you have to try to keep to them. And normally you only have like a 10% margin of error in terms of like if the price of petrol goes up and you need to adjust for that in your budget, depending on how much more you need to ask for, you actually have to go through a pretty lengthy process to get that budget change approved. So we're talking about very, very, very high, like sort of specificity funding. So the requirements for how that money moves are also very, very limited or are very particular. So the way you would normally send money, let's say from an HQ bank account, a treasury account that's held in London, to an implementing partner that's running your health program or a series of clinics on the ground in like Darfur. Normally, you would send that money from your bank account in London. That would start with a payment process that's initiated from your ERP, which could maybe be like SaaS or like could be a couple of different companies that run those. And they just manage tracking what kind of money is going where, which payments, their invoicing systems. You would initiate that through your bank. Your bank would then maybe send a transfer to, let's say, Port Sudan, but it would probably hit a bunch of intermediary banks along the way. It might get stopped and subject to OFAC checks. And then once it was in country, you would need to get it out of that bank to whoever it is that needs it in Darfur. Because there's such a breakdown in the banking infrastructure in Sudan at the moment, because it is one of the world's largest humanitarian crises, a lot of the banks themselves are not moving money between their own branches even. So you might then need to contract a provider, a cash provider who would actually organize the armored vehicles or whatever it takes to get the money physically to where it needs to go. And so a lot of the
Between those
time
places.
between those places. A lot of the time that would actually be done on a sort of like pre-finance basis. So that cash provider is taking all the risk to move that cash in situ. And then they have to reconcile it back. It has to get approved. Somebody at finance has to say, okay, great. Now we're going to initiate this payment. So that whole cycle can take a really long time. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of sort of slippage that can happen in between. Because let's say that takes
Yeah.
30 days to reconcile. That
Right.
cash
What
provider,
happens to their currency during,
what
yeah.
happens to FX? So normally the way contracts are written, it's that those cash providers that take that whole risk on. So this is where Coala Pay comes in. We do this sort of liquidity mapping, which is much more a kind of classic humanitarian aid sector skill. But with stablecoins, we're able to shorten those timelines so significantly that we can massively, massively decrease the risk involved for all parties. So a user would log on to our platform. They would sort of put money into their account through a really simple on-ramping system that we have. And then they'd be able to send that payment digitally through a smart contract. And that smart contract tracks exactly where it needs to go. We can do milestone-based payments. So let's say money moves into the smart contract and it doesn't actually release to the cash agent's wallet until they submit that proof of payment. So then instead of waiting 30 days to be repaid, it's more or less same day. And so as a result,
Wow.
we can usually offer much better rates. We're losing a lot less of that aid money to sort of those different intermediaries and just to the slippage that happens with time. And it takes a lot fewer people on both sides to try to coordinate all of those different pieces, which normally it's a lot of manpower hours, which all has to be accounted for in budget somewhere. So,
Mm.
really seeing like 99% faster delivery in terms of money to the ground. Often anywhere from like 35 to 70% more value preserved on each transaction. So, like, really significantly changing the way that the aid sector can do business just by introducing a blockchain layer into that system.
Wow. This always happens when we talk about Koala Pay, like between you and me, I'm always like, this is a game changing business. And it's interesting how it's one of the use cases where introducing crypto truly does make a difference. And I feel like, thank God we're seeing that with stable, because I was just going to lose hope. But it's just, yeah, every time you explain it to me, I'm like mind blown. I mean, privately and even in this conversation, we talk a lot about that last mile leg of stuff that needs to happen. And I know you mentioned a couple of things around that cash disbursement on the ground, around how banking systems are often even broken between local bank networks in places where there are humanitarian crises. Can you talk a little bit more about what last mile means to you? And then also for people that don't know about this, like how Koala Pay thinks about the like last mile leg of work that
Yeah.
needs to happen.
Yeah. I think there tends to be a misperception, which is that the idea that humanitarian aid money, and this comes from the way that I think web companies, blockchain companies have conceptualized about engaging in aid. So they've really fixated on this idea of what we would call multi-purpose cash or cash and voucher assistance. MPCA, it's very different. MPCA in the aid sector, or multi-purpose cash, MPC, and CVA, which is cash
Oh,
and
it's
voucher.
MPC.
Multi-purpose cash is when you just give money to people and you let them decide what they need. And there's so much evidence with
Is that a
that.
grant? Is that a
No,
it's
it's sort of
no,
it's
okay.
a way of doing aid work, and it is like we have decades of evidence about
I
this now
didn't
that it
know.
is the one of the most effective ways that you can have impact for like really cost effectively. Because let's say you're trying to figure out what needs to be done in a community that's just experienced a major shock or stressor. Normally, you'd have to go out and you do a needs assessment, which takes time and energy to have, enumerators out on the ground gathering data, people looking at that
Mm.
data. Okay, then what is the right intervention to support those communities? Then you have to go out and acquire those things, or you have to go and bring them across borders. Maybe they're not available in the local market. Maybe they are available in the local market, and then you need to do a market study to see how much is there, how sustainably is it there, are there any delays or gaps in the like availability of rights, or should
And
you choose a
are these
vendor?
structures and sorry to interrupt you, but are these structures in place because of the point you mentioned earlier? Because it's aid money, there's a lot of like regulation and rules about how it's being used and managed.
there's so much downward pressure on the aid sector around how they about value for money. And so, if, for example, you're going to do an intervention, you need to show that it was high impact and that you were very, very efficient. So, to do that, you don't want to be like throwing different interventions at the wall and seeing what sticks. You want to know that you have a good evidentiary basis to decide is it, for the example I always give is okay, somebody says, let's affect education in a community. We're going to go in and try to improve reading rates in children or literacy in children. So, we're going to buy these textbooks and we're going to import them because they're not available locally. Well, so then what happens? Somebody says at the end of a program, hey, we didn't actually see the reading skills improve in any of these kids. What happened? Was this a bad intervention? It's because somebody didn't actually talk to the community and figure out that kids can't, like, they're not getting sufficient caloric value at home because they're hungry. So the more meaningful intervention would have been to feed kids at school than to bring in a foreign textbook. And so it's a classic example of needing to know what you should do to have impact. What we found over lots of years of aid is that one of the best things you can do is just give people cash and let them decide what they need. Maybe one family needs food. Maybe another family needs, like access to a tutor. Maybe another family needs, like to have electricity in their house so their kid can study past like dark. So letting families make that choice. So unfortunately, though we know cash is really important and it is very helpful, it still only represents about like 18 to 20% of all aid spending. So I know. So all those examples of pilots you hear where it's like we sent money to digital wallets and people are using digital wallets and crypto, it's like that's great. It is 20% of 100% of aid flows, which move through to partners, to vendors,
This like
payments.
B2B network.
Exactly. And
Wow. Okay, so 80% is in this B2B network.
more like treasury flows. Yeah. And
Wow.
so
Okay.
while we have a product that's called Last Mile Aid, which is around doing that cash to households level, and we do that mostly walletlessly, but I can go into more of that detail later. We're much more focused on how we can create those efficiencies through that whole chain of payments. So even if you're going to end up doing a cash to households payment, you're going to start by moving that money from an HQ account to an office account inside country, and then so we're trying to really
First.
optimize that flow. So last
Wow. Okay.
in that context just means, okay, you have crypto in hand. How do you go from crypto to whatever the local currency is? And so that's where we can, we use, partners like Yellow Card, like Ramad Pay, Pretium, where they have coverage. Unfortunately, in a lot of the places where you have the most acute need, like Sudan, you don't really have any framework for them to operate there. And so that's where we build out what we call OSP networks. We call them OSPs, they're off-ramp service providers. We have to take them through a full KYC, KYB. We have to know what they're doing with their wallets. We have to monitor them ongoing
These are
because
people. These are people.
they might be, for example, a registered FX agent.
Okay. Okay. Oh, I thought they were always people. Interesting.
In some cases, it might be an individual, but in some cases, it might be a pharmacy network. And they have a lot of cash on hand locally, and they acquire all of their medication outside in a third country. And so trying to get money from a bank account in Sudan out is inconvenient and loses them cash along the way. So we do what's called a cash swap, which is essentially a peer-to-peer trade, but with all of the safety around it that is required for the aid sector. So for us, that like last mile, whether it's going to a household or it's being delivered to an office or it's coming in mobile money or it's coming cash in hand or to a bank account, it's how do you make that transition from digital currency, from crypto to the local currency pair. And that's where that adaptive liquidity mapping that we do is so essential because these are not currency pairs that you often find in like a lot of
Right.
debt
Available.
in a deck.
Yeah.
So, that really, what we are very proud to say is that thus far in the history of Koala Pay, I'm trying to look for some wood to knock on, but in the history of Koala Pay, we have a
I got it.
100% success rate in our payment
Wow.
completion, which is not just from wallet to
Insane.
wallet, but it's from wallet down to whatever the local currency is that somebody needs to have to actually be able to buy bread or whatever it is in the local market. So we're really going end to end. And most of the time, we were able to do those in like less than 30 minutes. So from the time money leaves an account in London to the time it is available for use in the market in Darfur, sometimes as little as 30 minutes.
Okay. Insane. That's just, yeah. Got to take a moment to just let that sink in. So
No, we
wild.
did we realized that we're always trying to figure out which metrics to track and which are the most important because because I am a trained anthropologist, I love data.
Love a study.
And somebody finally on our team was like, you know what? I'm just realizing that we have 100% success rate. I was like, that is such an incredible story. Because the amount of work that goes into that, not just the technology, but knowing how to navigate these particular corridors, and this is, I will say this other piece, which is that when you talk about last mile for us, what's really essential in that is not just the can you do it, but should you do it? And we call that protection financing. So just because you can get a wallet into the hands of somebody in a refugee camp does not mean that you should or that it is ethical. Because if somebody is in a very vulnerable moment, like most people are in a refugee camp, and you are causing incredible anxiety by forcing them to learn a new technology and trust some app on their phone that they've never seen before, in my mind, that is very rarely the best way to support somebody in that moment of need. And so we're very sensitive about the way we do payments, when we're dealing with vulnerable populations, because you have to be. That's the moral imperative.
Yeah. By the way, I do these pods all the time and I never take notes. And I'm literally taking notes during our conversation because it's so interesting that, I mean, both of us live in San Francisco, both of us are in tech conversations daily. And a lot of the conversation here is about how like stable game changing to fintech. And, this is how money needs to move on rails. And it sounds like there's a really viable case for bringing the Koala Pay business on chain, and the stats are proof of the pudding for that. But I'm curious, like you touched on this just before I asked this question, like what are the examples where stablecoins aren't actually just not effective for the business? Is it the like friction to learn a new technology? Is it things like off ramping and on ramping? Like that's still, I mean, we talk about this personally, like that's still a big part of the pie to figure out. Like, where does it not make sense that a traditional Silicon Valley tech company like might not even think about?
Yeah. I would reframe it a little bit because I think normally it does make sense. It's just how like thick is the friction to make it work as it stands now.
Yeah,
Um, like we really, even though we would say like 9 times out of 10 doesn't make sense to try to pay an individual household in stable, it doesn't mean that we're still not using stable on the back end to improve efficiencies. So that payment tool, I talked about that last mile aid tool, it's using a more traditional aid approach, which is that, you register your beneficiary list. And in this case, you're then giving them a QR code and that we call them aid tags. And then once they've assigned that QR code to their beneficiary number, we don't ever need to see any of the personal information of that beneficiary of that household, but they can upload that to Last Mile Aid, which is our system, and then essentially choose which cash agent they want to go out and do that disbursement. The cash agents submit their bids for what the pricing is that they would apply for that. Because usually it's a big difference delivering aid like in the Red Sea state than it is delivering aid in Darfur. So you need to account for the difference of security. And so then once you say, okay, that's the cash agent I want to use, that cash agent goes out. They're still handing cash to people in hand. So that, beneficiary in a camp is never touching a digital wallet. That cash agent is, however. And so as they scan the QR code, the smart contract is reimbursing them for that cash that they've delivered. So that's what I mean as far as like really shortening that turnaround time. And what we find is that then those cash agents are much more willing to give very beneficial rates for the work that they're doing because they're not
they get an
taking.
immediate reimbursement.
Exactly. And so there's still benefits of using stable there. There's huge benefits of using stable coins there. I think there's a little bit of a false focus on how many like households have wallets that they're receiving aid in. It's sort of like if we're completely focused on that, which I have really seen a lot of our Web3 colleagues get stuck in this, where they're like, let's get money out into these. So it tells a good story. People love the media around it. Um, but it is incredibly difficult to replicate and it is very difficult to scale. And
So
customer
difficult.
acquisition cost is huge.
Oh my
So
God.
why
Yeah.
not focus on capturing efficiencies a little bit further up the chain where it's much easier and the people who are engaged in that are better able to understand that and then replicate it at scale? Like one household payment versus $100 million it's going to flow from an organization into 2 countries. Like for me, that case is so clear.
We worked with a company that was giving out loans to entrepreneurs in Ghana, and we had passkey enabled wallets. But a lot of these households wanted to share their wallet with their family. And how do you share your freaking passkey? You have to, use a password. And so we rolled out passwords and rolled out pins. And it's such a tricky design space. I think the B2B model, to your point, is interesting because it's just a layer up, yet honestly might even be more more effective at delivering value. One thing in the aid community is like one thing that's always surprised me and like made me really happy is the aid community kind of maps impact as like lives saved.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I know obviously like that's a metric that's is that applicable to Koala's business or like how do you guys think about that? And I know the team is obviously stacked with a lot of former humanitarians. And so like how do you think about success with the company?
We definitely focus on the kind of traditional metrics around like how much is moving across the platform, delivery time, all that stuff. But of course, because of what we're working in, when we're seeing a payment to a local partner, usually because again, so we're also doing that through the smart contracts and we embed some of that data, not to go on, but so that if, for example, in the future, Coala Pay ever goes away, our users need to be able, not that we're expecting that, but just to say, that's how we think about like sustainability and responsibility as a business. If we ever went away, for example, our users would still have in their wallets these proof of payment tokens that provide all of the documentation they need about what that payment was for, who it went to, what the rates were at the time, all that information. They own it. So it's not sitting on our server somewhere and then we need to reconstitute it if they ever get audited. It's their data and they don't have to kind of try to piece it together through like Etherscan or whatever, which is, not just such a nightmare. So like we really in those payment details, you might have information about, this payment is to support a food distribution to 100,000 families or something like that. So we do passively in some cases have that impact data that we're always super interested to see. But also our customer success sort of approach is that we really are embedded in these because we're really much more like institutional SaaS kind of. So, these are not one-off little payments. Like we are inside our user organizations. And so, we have like a global framework agreement with one of our users. It's going to, 2 years that we're able to work with them in any of their countries. So we're helping them literally from the starting point of like, how are we going to set up our digital wallet infra to how are we going to manage this program? And so that means that we know very intimately what they're doing. Usually we don't have to know if they want to have their complete privacy, they can have it, but it tends to be they lean on us for that support. So we track it only as far as like, it makes sense to track it. It's not something we force our users to provide us that information, but we're of course very curious to see how, the difference in 30% more money reaching the ground means 30% more families that can be provided with humanitarian aid. So that kind of stuff, matters a lot to us, even though we are a for-profit business. So, our North Star metric is like how much money is moving across the platform. But of course we care the quality of that money too.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And it's interesting to hear that like that QR code captures so much metadata, it sounds like,
So the QR
which I'm
codes are made to
sure
be a handful, but the proof of payment token is actually an NFT, and it is this was our like little nod
cool.
to celebrating the sector, and that it's an algorithmically generated piece of art. That the algorithm that we use, the sort of variables that get plugged into it are actually related to like, is it food programming or shelter or human rights, and the location and things like that. So where it's safe to do so. But so that information, it generates this image that sits in people's wallets and it's unnecessary frankly that we didn't need to do it like that. But I also feel like the great blanding of the world, everything's getting more gray and more boring, and I love that about web3 that there's been this embrace of a kind of return to art and personality, and I want to keep true to some of
Yeah,
that
I
too.
get that. Okay. So you've talked a lot about your business. Now walk us through the upcoming products that kind of map to this. And I know you have a little bit, but like, what exactly is upcoming in this kind of next iteration of the platform?
When you design programs, like my background in humanitarian aid is really on program design. One of the models and the heuristics that I've used a lot in thinking about those programs is like knowledge, behavior change. So like when you plan, how are you going to get from point A to point B? You think about first, people need access to the information, then they need to believe that that information is valuable to them, and then they need to act on it. And we sort of embedded that a little bit in the way that we rolled out our product. So the first product, we call it version 1 of the platform, was really just like, you need to know how a blockchain transaction works. You need to know how stablecoins work, and we need to strip back everything else as much as possible so that like you can take away, if nothing else, this is how it works. And then you need to use it and you need to see the benefits. So we would track in exhaustive detail every cent, to compare it to how they'd been moving previously so we could benchmark and really show the benefits of using the system. Now we're finally at version 2 of our platform. We formed the
Yay.
company in 2023. So we've been moving fast, but it's, of course, like aid workers are perpetual, like type A's. We can never do enough. We're never doing enough. So we all feel like it's so slow. And every once in a while, we need our investors to be like, cool, your jets, you're doing fine.
You're doing great. Yes.
Hold
Uh-huh.
ourselves to such a high standard. But so version 2 is really capturing everything we've learned through those client interactions up until now and is really focused now on institutionalization. So if you think about version 1 as kind of like introduction, version 2 is institutionalization. How do you go from pilot purgatory to like this is now just a tool
So
that
real.
runs inside your payments and in your bank accounts. It's just another tool in your toolbox. So version 2 really feels a lot like a treasury tool. So, for example, you can set up your HQ wallet, and they call them hubs, and
Ooh,
set
I didn't know that.
payment controls around how many people need to sign a transaction. You have social login to set up that wallet, thanks to our amazing partners, Para. Um, so it makes it completely streamlined. You don't even really need to know that it's happening on blockchain. Let's say you set up your hub so that, your treasury person, your finance person, your compliance person have, the ability to sign transactions, but also to just view them, or to approve payments without actually being able to execute payments. So you can do a lot to mimic the internal controls that those organizations already have in their existing ERPs. That word again around how they manage their payments currently. But then you can also set up a hub for your Sudan office. And that Sudan office could have spending limits that they can approve and execute payments up to a certain amount without having to knock on the door of HQ. So you can really set those up. It's completely customizable to make it so that you can use the technological innovation that comes from smart contracts and safe wallets, which is what's ultimately underlying all of this infrastructure, to create programmatic innovation and to kind of push for things you just could never do before because you just had no, you couldn't put somebody in the Sudan office on the HQ treasury. Like you just couldn't coordinate in ways they never could before.
And that on that coordination point, and obviously, like we think a lot about programmable money rails and like what that does to businesses. And so I'm interested in understanding. So if a someone in the Sudan office needed to request budget from HQ, is that an email and a budget meeting and a spreadsheet? Like what does that kind of
Oh, it would have been before.
classical?
Yeah.
Yeah, what is the classical? Okay, so that's
Yeah,
obviously that
that's
takes
like
weeks or
oh,
months,
budget
right?
forecasting. Let me tell you the horrors because it's not like your Sudan office is one program. You probably have a health and nutrition program. You maybe have a livelihoods program, and you have a shelter program, and those are all different teams, and they all have different donors. Like one of those could be U.S. government funding, one might be ECHO funding from the EU. So they all have different budget reconciliation and forecasting processes. So imagine there's some poor schmo in the Sudan office, whose job it is to try to get everybody to submit those documents in time so they can submit a single request to HQ so they can, because that payment's going to take weeks to get there on time because of the banking delays. So they can get the money in the operational accounts and then subdivide them out to the teams potentially based on what their expenditure needs are. And if one team is late, the whole system is gummed up. So, and that's because it takes so long to move money through legacy rails. Now with Koala Pay, those teams can just kind of make ad hoc requests anytime they need to move money between their hub wallets, and it's instant, just instant transactions. So it's a
Yeah.
game changer in terms of just organizational
Insane.
efficiency within the way that Treasury manages itself, which also then reduces their exposure to FX risks, right? Because like I used to run an office in Juba in South Sudan. And I remember the absolute headache of getting to the end of month reconciliation, having to figure out exactly what the exchange rate was, which was a super, super
Right.
volatile exchange rate at every transaction in the books to make sure that we could account for like why there were a couple $1,000s of slippage that had happened just because of those fluctuations. That is human effort and human time. It used to take me at least a couple of days to close the books every month. We're able to now just do that instantaneous reconciliation. It's a hard sell when you start saying we're going to move this to blockchain. Somebody somewhere in the, in the structure
In that value chain. Yeah,
has
yeah,
taken
totally.
years to get a system that works. It's kind of like it's
Right.
their special because I've seen it when you build a system that
Yeah.
works, how hard it is to really protect it. But once they see it, and they see how much easier it's going to make their lives. It's like, it's just so, revelatory. So I live for those moments when it's like you get them over the hump of getting used to it and getting through the
Mm,
behavior. And then they're like, this is so valuable to me. I will never change. And we see repeat clients, people who started with a pilot here and then they expand to a framework agreement and then they want to take it to another country. So once they really get into the weeds, they see how much efficiency it brings and just how much easier it makes their lives.
yeah, it's contract expansion season for you guys. That's
Yeah,
exciting.
we just
Yeah,
had I was telling you socially, but, yeah, we just learned this morning that we've won a really large framework agreement that's gonna allow us to work with, like, 6 different organizations, some of the biggest 8 actors. So it's taking our client list up to sort of, like, all really a lot of the, like, major 8 actors in the sector. So really it feels like,
yeah.
broken out. We've broken containment. We're no longer, like, something that the innovation team tried.
Tell, as you said.
Like,
Yeah,
we're out there in the world and and it's a really good feeling. So it's like it's it brings a lot of joy to the whole team because like you said, we all come from the aid sector. When we can come with solutions, like it's so rare in our sector. You're coming with good news like, "Hey, we have something we can do to make your life easier." It's so rare. It's always problems, problems, problems.
right.
So,
Yeah, exactly. Well, it
just
sounds like also the way that you guys have thought about like it's the platform as something that's like someone can pull in side by side as like a tool in their stuff that they're using to solve for this, I think is really interesting. And I hear you. I mean, the innovation lab, yeah, I completely empathize because that's just hell in itself. And having a real thing that people can actually use and touch is so exciting.
yeah.
On, sorry, we've spent so much time on I do want to get into a little bit about your background and some of the more company building questions. But on cash availability, obviously you're operating in a whole swath of different countries. How do you manage that? And how are you sourcing these kind of OSP providers that maybe have accessibility to this cash? And especially in places where, like you said, cash availability is so limited or on and off.
Yeah. I think this is where working with aid workers, like you just could not choose a better group of people. They're so scrappy and they're such problem solvers. Like at the end of the day, that is like 90% of our job is just problem solving. And so when you hire somebody who has been previously tasked, for example, with moving like $40 million a week into post Taliban controlled Afghanistan, like when that is something that they've had to do before, it means that they know how to get into the market, how to see who's there, find those little pockets of liquidity, figure out what kind of contracting you need to do. How do you flow down your contract terms with clients down to those partners? How do you, manage all the risks and concerns? So when you take those people and you stick them into a Web3 company, you have really great results. So our initial, for example, OSP liquidity network came from hiring a local partner liaison who's sort of like our local success managers. And they tend to be people who are in the crypto scene locally, but have some community organizing experience. So we hired our first ever person who in Sudan. And I found him on a Discord because he was the only person I could find who had a community that was about crypto trading in Sudan. And so I reached out to him. And I was like, hey, I'm trying to learn more about the local, gang there. And he sort of said he turns out he's a GP in Ireland. I mean, he's got like a very serious day job, but he was like, I really want to be involved in this because I want to be able to help local organizations. And so he knew who some of the big peer-to-peer traders were with deep liquidity. And then through our engagement with other, you know, as we brought on other humanitarian team members who have worked on big humanitarian programs, like one of our team members used to be the deputy, sort of like deputy program lead for an OTI, Office of Transition Initiatives, so U.S. government program in Sudan. So she's had to do this, finding those pots of liquidity, when it was all bank stuff. That part of it, that operational part is something that e-workers do all the time. We just did never have the digital tools that we have with Koala Pay. So we're taking a team of people who already knew how to find that liquidity on the ground in those kinds of places and those constrained care corridors and just giving them an incredibly potent tool to use to make it all work. And so they're
Yeah.
just like adding OSPs like left and right because they're people they've worked with before. We have partners, for example, that are getting payments on Koala Pay and they say, hey, we want to work with our trader that we trust to do the cash delivery. Would you mind bringing them into your network? And then we take them through an extensive due diligence process. So we call that like sort of snowballing. So you kind of roll through and you add more and then they recommend somebody who's growing really
Oh, and it's
organic.
just a referral network of these OSP. Oh,
In, most corridors in Sudan, for instance, we've got multiple layers of redundancy. And that's the same in many of the
Wow.
countries where we operate. And, we can off ramp in 50 plus countries now.
Insane. Yeah, that's insane. That's where, so this is where the crypto on and off ramp becomes really important. And I know you and I spend a lot of time talking about this, but what I understand of where the crypto on ramp fits in is kind of having that intermediary piece where you can go from an OSP's wallet to crypto really quickly. And then in the cases of a household disbursement, having the ability for multiple OSBs to kind of be excited about picking up a bid. But can you talk to that like crypto on and off ramp problem a little bit more? Because I know that you guys have spent so much time evaluating all the various options,
Yeah.
and where does that fit into the stack? And did what I described, is that accurate?
Mostly. So we don't allow, like, an OSP would never be initiating a payment across our platform because they're receiving settlement in stablecoins and then initiating a payment out in mobile money, bank, or in cash
They're
in hand.
off ramping
They're off ramping. Yeah, that's what the
via
OSP.
one of the via one.
Yeah. Yeah, the
Okay.
OSPs are providers to off ramp. So whether they're getting that stablecoin and then basically doing like a cash swap with their own, what they have available, or if we're using Yellow Card, we would consider Yellow Card an OSP, for example. So they're an off ramp service provider.
Okay. Yep.
So
Okay.
normally we would try to prioritize those more like formalized OSPs in a off ramp. So if we're doing it in Kenya, we'd go to Pretium every time. Like they are excellent. We were able to do 2,000 payments to households directly off ramped into M-Pesa payments, the local kind of preferred payment system there. So the way that it happened is an NGO, made a payment into that smart contract. Then the OSP had to deliver those payments into M-Pesa, and they were being reimbursed through the smart contract for each one of those payments that was
One for
delivered.
one.
So
Got
30
it.
minutes, we paid, 2,000 people into M-Pesa accounts. Our client upstream never had to touch M-Pesa. Our client downstream never had to log into Koala Pay like the OSP never had to, get onto Koala Pay. Those
And onboard.
have a digital wallet. They were getting paid where they wanted to be paid. So OSP almost like is the connecting piece that allows us to offer wherever people want to be paid. If they want to be paid in crypto, they can get paid in crypto across the platform. That's also possible.
Right.
Mm. On-ramping then is the piece that is super interesting because we're trying to reduce the cost of sending bank payments. So we can't have an on-ramp provider in the US for a client that's sending money from an HQ account in London because the payment costs and delays of sending money from London to whatever their settlement account is in the US. It's just too long. So we've had to piece together the best partners to be able to give that seamless on-ramping experience. And it's also essential that they have a static IBAN.
Yes.
Reason for that is because to get your like a big institutional client like this to be able to hold crypto in their treasury and in their ledger, it's really, really hard unless they can
About a
represent.
ledger, forget about it.
I know.
Yeah.
So, to show it as a one-to-one transaction, so we can encourage them to, in their books, consider a stable coin held just like a dollar, which is in keeping with where like both Mika and Genius are going. But it just makes it much easier to get through that adoption. But in order to do that, they need to have a bank account that just shows up as like an external bank account that they have on the books. So it's really easy
Mm,
reconciliation back to their ERP, which their ERP shows we sent money from our bank account to this bank address. And they can have the purpose of that. And then the proof of payment tokens come in and they can prove this sort of close the
map
loop,
that.
each one of those transactions out to that account.
Okay.
Because the main thing in aid is who has custody of the cash at any given time. Koala Pay never custodies money. No one ever sends us money and then we distribute it on.
Yeah.
Never.
And that was an important reason why you guys wanted a non-custodial partner.
Very important. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the second that you are holding aid money, a whole new set of cascading requirements kick in. What we wanted was to be able to show, like, no, when you move your money from here to this bank account, it is an instant upload into a digital version of that. So the custody delay from a US dollar to a digital dollar is almost nothing. And therefore, you don't need to account for that in your books beyond like this is the transaction flow because
Hence
nobody's
the IN. Yeah.
that's where that static
Okay.
IBAN is so important.
Interesting. Wow. Can you, sorry, tangent. Can you talk to a little bit of the requirements that would be imposed on you guys if you were considered custodial?
Well, we'd be a money mover, which is not something we want to be. Also, from an ethical standpoint, if you are in a position to determine who is a qualified beneficiary of aid money, that is a very different situation. So if we had the ability to impose when a transaction can happen and to whom, we'd be a program implementer, which we're not. Our partners are making all the decisions about who is going to get paid and how much and when. We can say we don't work in that corridor because it's not legal to do crypto in that corridor. That's totally within, capacities, but we don't want to be in the business of saying we think this person deserves aid or doesn't. We, of course, as a US company, have all the requirements. Well, actually, this is an interesting point. Technically, because we're not a money mover, we probably don't need to do KYC, KYB. But
Mm,
because we have a forward posture on compliance, we have from day one done it anyway. And we
yeah.
do sort of proactive AI threat management and like looking at monitoring those wallets within like 6 transactions distances. So like we are very on the front foot. What would happen if we get a ping is that we ping that up to the user and say, we have this information. How do you want to address this? Because we should not be the ones making decisions about who is eligible for aid. That is the requirement of those people who are,
Correct.
who are operating on humanitarian waivers. Humanitarian waivers are sort of blanket waivers that exist even in sanctioned corridors to make sure that aid money can move. But you want only verified humanitarian actors to have access to those flows. And that is only work with actors that qualify for those flows in those corridors, in corridors where there are the Sudan, for example, 12 people on the sanctions list, but it's, we still have to be very careful. Um, in a place like Kenya, a little bit less worried. And we
A
still do
little
KYC,
flexible.
but like a private company who wants to do social impact. So yeah,
So
it's a
cool.
constant
Yeah.
balance, but really the main thing is that like we do not want to be custodians of aid money because it brings with it both, licensing requirements and also ethical considerations. And we just think that's better left to the humanitarian aid organizations themselves.
Yeah. That makes a ton of sense. And I as you were talking about this, I mean, it sounds like there's so much know-how and specificity in how aid money needs to be dispersed and used. And so I'm curious, what was the biggest surprise or like surprise feature that you've had to prioritize building for these sorts of constraints that like a tech, like fintech person like wouldn't think of?
We just had actually a really interesting experience where we had put together this list of requirements of things that we needed. And then we had a Web3 dev on our team who doesn't come from the sector, who was working over the weekend, looked at it and was like, this is superfluous. I'm going to streamline this to what's actually required. And he has incredible expertise in Web3. So he was technically right. There were superfluous elements, but those superfluous elements were there because they're just weird requirements in the aid sector that are not intuitive if you're not from there. And so then we had to come back and put all that stuff back in. It is when we first said we're going to move payments to smart contracts, even people were like, why? Why are you adding this complexity? Just do wallet to wallet payments. So we were like, because money in the aid sector just can't fly all over the place. It's attached always, always to a contract. And so having that data about that puts rules around how that can move is super essential. And also to be able to capture all of those details about why it moved and to
Yeah,
whom.
right.
All of that is essential because, like, our users are never I mean, I hate Etherscan, and I've been staring at it for 3 years. It's like how I feel. I used to say, like, if you try to send somebody to a Discord to try to figure out when they can't, like, when they need to troubleshoot something, that is abject cruelty. Like, it is so stressful, and
So
I you know what I mean? Like,
a
I have an
Discord scary.
IHC, and
You
I
could
can't.
never get me in a Discord.
So, there's things like that where it's sort of like the tools that have become the norm in Web3, we're like, listen, those are great. So we've had to build a lot that we didn't anticipate building because we thought somebody else was building it. But we've talked about this. There's also a
Yeah.
lot of vaporware in Web3 and people who just don't work as fast as we work. That's been a really hard realization. Like somebody's like, yeah, it'll be done in 2 months. And it's like, 8 months later, things we built out of sheer frustration with how inefficient other teams were. And I do think, like, this is me on my soapbox, that like, you see the sentiment about Web3 now among communities, and it's kind of like, look, there's no way to blame yourselves here and ourselves because we're part of it. We were being lapped by TradFi because like people were not serious. You can't just be
Now,
like,
what does that mean? You're not serious people. It's so
yeah,
true.
like, if you're not
Yeah.
actually turning up and like, shipping, what are you doing? What are we doing here?
Yeah, yeah.
So if nothing else, I think that pressure, it's like hopefully positive peer pressure, but I think we're hitting a point where professionalization in the sector is like do or die. We've had that posture from day one. And so it did mean that we ended up building a lot more than we thought we would have to because just there weren't products that we needed to use were not up to snuff. That's why we were so excited to find Para because you actually were.
Yeah. We talk about this all the time. We're always like, oh my God, like we're so happy to be working with a team that really gets it. Yeah. It's been amazing from day one. Also, I'm in the office, so if there's background noise, the team
It's
is
also be like
hanging
fiddling
out
with.
and chatting. But yes, we got to get you in the office at some point. So you and
Yeah, we
Courtney
would love
at
that.
some
We
point.
would love that. It's good
Yeah.
to be able to co-work and, because our team is fully distributed because we're all over the world. We've got developers in Bhutan and we've got folks in Cape Town, and it's very global. So we can always use a little bit of socialization.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. What is the best anecdote from some of the early research you had done for the company? Because you obviously ran a bunch of field offices yourself. You've had tons of experience working on the ground in general as well. What is like the anecdote that sticks out to you when you're like, okay, this is why I started this company?
Yeah, the big one was that, really the origin of Koala Pay was, I have to give all credit to like Myanmar civil society and the human rights community there, because I jokingly always say like I've never been a joiner. So if I feel like everything is really, a little bit too culty, I'm like, "Well, I don't like it." And that's how crypto felt to me from the outside. And then when the Myanmar junta did a coup in 2021, illegally deposed the democratically elected civilian government. All of a sudden, overnight, very, very dangerous to send money to bank accounts. And we had all these incredible local organizations that were just like putting themselves in harm's way left and right to help their communities. And then on top of that, you had donors that were like, we can't send you this, million, $2 million that we need to pay you, except in a bank account that has your organizational name on it. And they were saying, look, we can't register with this junta government. It'll put us in danger. The secret police will show up at our door. They will detain us. And this is a dangerous time. And some,
And you were in the country at the time.
was sad. I was not. I was in the Netherlands then, or Berlin. I can't remember. Finishing my PhD right up because COVID happened and I left. I had a flat in Yangon and I had gone, to wait. And then the coup happened shortly thereafter. And so I still had my flat and I was just planning on coming back as soon as COVID ended. And then it was like, yeah, that went on a lot longer than anyone expected. And then there was a
Right.
military coup. So I didn't get back again until 2022. Um, but so, we needed to pay all these amazing organizations and they were saying, can you find a way to do this safely? And they were saying, can you pay some stable coins? Um, and
In 2022.
in 2022, 2021 even. And they're very, I mean, so many incredible organizations that are absolutely leading the way and are the most essential part of any humanitarian response. I mean, the emergency response rooms in Sudan have literally saved millions of people's lives. Same thing in Myanmar. These smaller organizations, local organizations, are the heartbeat of the humanitarian response there. They deserve all the respect in the world. If they tell me, can you pay me in this way? I will do anything in my power to do it. And so that was what started me having to unpick my own biases. So it's like, look, I would, go to the ends of the earth for you guys. So if you're saying we need to pay you in stable coins, let me go back to the drawing table and figure out what needs to happen for that to happen. Because whatever we can do to make it safer for local humanitarian aid actors, like we have to do it because they are
Yeah.
so many ways. We worry about risk in the aid sector, but it's an actuarial form of risk. It's like, what if we can't account for $5,000? That pales in comparison to the risk that these organizations take. It is physical, and they're out there putting their lives on the line. The least we can do is go through this discomfort of figuring out how to send a stablecoin payment. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like
How to make this efficient.
a very small.
Yeah. And I mean, classic, like, I guess, Silicon Valley mindset in building a successful app is like, how do you get, users retained and keep them like retained in the app every day? For your use case, like, is retention just like it working? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that 100% success rate on payments is really what drives retention. So in some cases, we're not even the cheapest solution, right? Like there might be other ways to send money in that are cheaper, but they might fail sometimes too. So really, like you go to Koala Pay when you're like, it is really difficult to pay consistently in this place. Can you bring your expertise, that operational expertise, plus the technology to bear on solving this problem? So we're really about creating incredibly important redundancy layer for payments, as well as something that is reliable when you've got, usually when you have a humanitarian crisis happening. There's a lot of stuff going on in terms of decisions and how you're going to operationalize that response. If you can take one of those things off your plate and have somebody like, Koala Pay that's helping to be your really trusted partner and making sure money at least is moving, then you don't have to focus on that and you can focus on all the other really tough stuff. So, we really aim to be that partner, that the technology partner that helps to make payments just easier. And I will say, like, looking at global events as they are, like the importance of having a redundancy payment infrastructure that can be activated regardless of geopolitical events. Like I always say,
Mm.
you know, if you do not understand the benefit of having a payment system that is divorced from sovereign states, then congratulations. You live in the tiny sliver of the world where your rights and your access to financial infrastructure and all of that are more or less protected. That is not the
Yeah.
majority experience. And very quickly, that can stop being the experience for you too. And like in the same way that you want to download Signal before you need to send encrypted messages, you want to have a way to pay people safely before the banking sector shuts down. Because by the time it shuts down, now you have operational disruption. You can't pay like households, so many other. So having that redundancy in place, like regardless if you think it's looking dicey, QualiPay really is like we come in and we're able to essentially construct a functional payment infrastructure anywhere in the world. We can stand that up in a moment's notice. And so, it becomes an essential tool in the toolbox. It doesn't have to replace everything that's
Right.
working. We come in the places where it's not working.
Yeah. That's awesome. I mean, it makes a ton of sense. And on the even Qualipay often not being the cheapest option, I think about like gas station sushi. Like, yeah, it's available, but like, sometimes like you want to go for the more like premium, better product that's gonna not make you sick,
Yeah, and we are,
100%
I
of the time.
would
So,
say actually, like, a lot of the time we are the cheaper option because we're able to preserve more, but it's where we struggle, and I think this is true for a lot of, new when you're creating
mhm,
essentially a new like, there's a blue sky or like a what do you call it? Blue ocean market, so we're creating a new way of working, and so it's hard sometimes for teams to get their heads around, well, how do we account for this cost structure? Because it's like, we're overly transparent about where we apply costs, where a lot of like, financial service providers, for example, would
are
hide their
not.
fees in their FX.
Totally.
We'll be like, "No, if you can access the market rate, this is the market rate today." And then we have our percentage fee on the transaction. And people are like, "But you're more expensive." And I'm like, I'm begging you, procurement teams, do the math, look at the FX rate,
Yeah.
and then look at the
It's
percentage
crypto.
fee.
Yeah, it's like so much of crypto is transparent, and I think that is like a benefit. But more often than not, most people don't know that they're paying those like hidden fees,
I have no idea.
and so
Yeah.
it's so cool. Okay, I want to round it out with a lightning round. It's just two questions, but second to last question is: what is your prediction for what cross border money movement will look like in the next 3 to 5 years?
I think it's going to look very similar to how it looks now. You won't even know that it's happening on blockchain rails. I think for like 90% of people using payment systems are going to not even know that what's happening on the back end is crypto. I think in the kinds of places where we work, it will be apparent that that is what's happening. But I think that's only appropriate in the kinds of places where we work, where people are like, they don't trust the banks. They know that something isn't working. And that then having this additional infrastructure that's visible makes sense. But for like 90% of people in the world, it's all going to be crypto. You just won't know that's what it is.
Awesome. And then dream country to expand to.
I have to get recency bias out of my mind right now because obviously the
I know
current.
because you're probably like working some of these, yeah. But like, what is the like the shining example that like if you were to like get this example moving, like
Yeah.
this is like the explainer for why Koala Pay matters.
I really think Sudan, we got so lucky that a former colleague of mine who, we'd worked together in Syria, and then he was the country director in Sudan for Norwegian Refugee Council, one of our earliest clients. And so he was really the one who came and said, "Hey, I heard you're working on the payments problem and like we can't pay anybody." And we were so
Wow.
lucky. that we came into that so early. I mean, I think agreed with him to come do something with him in 2023. So by 2024, we were already in Sudan. And I see a lot of other competitors, like sort of close competitors, I guess, who are like interested in coming into Sudan because it is a huge humanitarian crisis. And it's sort of
Mm,
like, we've been here for 2 years. We've been operating all over the country. We've got such robust off ramps. We got very lucky in the way that we entered really our work into Sudan. So it's a hard question because we tend to work in the not so nice places, or I mean, Sudan is a beautiful country with incredible culture and in history, and it's absolute tragedy what's happened there. So I don't mean this to sound like that. It's a bad place. I mean it in the
yeah, yeah,
sense we go where systems have broken down.
right.
It's like it's always sad if you need something like Koala Pay somewhere because it means like the people are suffering. But I'm very, very glad that it means that we're able to provide support to communities in a moment where they desperately need it and in a way that can make them safer. That's really important. We talk a lot about this, like protection focused financing. It's the first and foremost, like you cannot bring a new technology just because you can. It's not ethical. Like you bring a technology when it can help people and when you can do it safely. And that safely part first, always.
I love it. I'm taking notes on that. Um, Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining today.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's
Always a
a
pleasure.
pleasure as always. And yeah, I mean, I feel like there's so much more I want to talk about. So we might have to bring you back for a part two, but
Always
this is
like
a pleasure.
so happy to participate and always would encourage also inviting the rest of the team because like that was the coolest thing.
Yes.
My best memory of building Koala Pay is like that I got to go to these people that I've been following their careers for ages, and I've been able to say like, "Hey, do you want to take this risk? Come on this weird adventure with me." And some of the smartest people I know said yes. So I get to be
Yeah.
surrounded by
The best team.
legends, and
Yes.
we
I
all
can
do
vouch
that,
for that.
which helps a lot. But they're so good at their jobs. It's incredible, and so always would encourage bringing like any one of them on to hear their perspectives because each and every one of them has something incredible to add to the conversation.
Love it. We'll have to do that. Amazing. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having
And we're going to round this out.